Okay, welcome. This is an introduction video to a seminar I organised about concussion in sport. This was done at my university, Nottingham Trent University, in October 2022, the end of October. The idea of the event was to bring together people from across various disciplines and fields who have an interest in concussion in sport. It wasn't related just simply to academic knowledge. It was about knowledge coming from different communities, from sporting practitioners, from people who work in medicine and sport, and trying to bring together people from all of those sort of places, one, to share knowledge, and two, to figure out where we go next. That was basically the title of the event: Concussion in Sport, What Do We Know and What's Next? My personal motivation to organise this was a personal interest in this topic because of the research I've done, and probably more importantly, trying to be able to help my PhD students figure out what they were going to do with their next few years of studying. I've got three students working in this area, and being able to not only understand the academic knowledge, which is obviously important to them, but also what the communities need, what the coaches need, what the athletes need, what they think are most important issues. That was really important for me. So the day was really successful. We had 30 or so people come together and from all walks of life, practitioners, activists, obviously academics, junior academics, professors, coaches, people who work in sports medicine. And throughout the day, there was lots of really good chances for conversations, for networking, all of that sort of good stuff. So I'll just briefly introduce the talks. First off, we can't present Sahil Gupta's talk, who went first. And there was some issues around the material that he's got in there and who owns the rights to it and things like that. But Sahil talked to us about spotting concussions on the field. Following that, we had Professor Tom Denning from Nottingham University, just down the road, who came to speak to us about CTE and some of his work as a clinician working with dementia. Tom's presentation was excellent and really got into some of the details of what we do and we don't know. And interestingly, three of the first four speakers highlighted that we didn't know what concussion is, which most of us who are working in this academically know that. But I think out there in the world, I think there's an assumption that we actually know what concussion is and how to treat them well. We certainly don't. After that, it was Penny Watson. Penny's husband is a former professional footballer who suffers now with dementia brought on through his playing of football. Penny spoke really passionately about this topic, as you can imagine, and having that different angle to be able to understand it from an activist perspective, someone who's out there trying to campaign for more awareness and more support for these players, was a great way of shifting the day a little bit as well, in terms of some of the topics that we discussed and how they were discussed as well. And then the final talk before the break was Professor Angus Hunter, who's head of department here at Nottingham Trent University. Angus is a neurologist by trade and spoke again around some of the issues around CTE and concussion in sport in relation to some of the problems that we have with understanding it. Then we had a breather, we had a bit of a break, and then the afternoon started off with two of my PhD students. Reema Hashmi kicked it off. Now, as I introduced at the start, Reema's had some difficulties with her speech, brought on through issues connected to her participation in combat sports, taken quite a serious blow to the head. So Reem's got personal experience of this, as have I, as a lot of people who do research on this topic, and speaks about some of the issues there is in relation to the medical knowledge that is circulated within athletes, within athletic groups, within teams, in effect, the way in which coaches and athletes might advise each other as to how to cope or mitigate issues around concussion. And as you can imagine, the knowledge that they have is not necessarily that well developed. So there's some problems there. Then Debbie Forbes was next. Debbie presented some of her work almost in a projection as to what she thinks she's going to do in her PhD. Debbie's writing her first paper up now. And the premise for her work, where she looks at women in sporting settings in terms of their medical care, is that there might be some unique problems that women face. One, because of the traditional domination of most sports by men, also the traditional exclusion of women from medicine, and how that combines might lead us to think that understanding the experiences of women within health, well-being, and ill health within sport is a very interesting, potentially important topic. And then we finished off with Dominic Malcolm from Loughborough University. Dominic talked to us in a broad sense about the social scientific study of concussion. One of the things that Dom's argued in various places is that the biomedical model of understanding concussion has dominated, and this brought us some fantastic knowledge forward about that. But it does also miss some of the key elements that social cultural studies can highlight, especially in relation to the network of people, the cultures of sport that shape the way that people interact with concussion. After that, we had a bit of time together to discuss what the futures are and where we're going next. And I'm currently in the process of working with the people who spoke to write up the findings from the day into a journal article. So eventually, certainly not for a few months, eventually I'll post that below in this link as well. There's also a link below to documents to download, which include the presentations and some key papers. So have a look at that. Any questions or comments, please fire me a message. You can find me on this website by submitting into the forms that are knocking around in different places, the contact forms, or you can find me on Twitter easily enough as well. Links to that are on the website. If you have a look in the publications section, you'll see some work related to this topic as well. Okay. Any questions? Give me a shout. Cheers.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Chris. I've been really looking forward to this symposium, actually, because it's a varied programme, it's highly interdisciplinary, and I think there is a lot for us all to learn from the different things that people have got to say. So I'm Tom Denning, I'm Professor of Dementia Research at another university in Nottingham. I'm an old age psychiatrist by background, so I'm not a sports medicine expert, I'm not a concussion expert, I'm not really doing research in this area either. So I'm coming at this more as a clinician who is interested in things that are likely to change our practice over, in the foreseeable future. I've always been interested in, what's coming up, what do we need to know more about, and so CTE, as I will refer to it, is definitely part of that. So in a way, we're jumping to the other end of the spectrum from the concussions that you've just seen to slightly further down the road. So I was going to show some videos, and I'm now really glad that I didn't, because you've seen some, but also they make me feel queasy actually watching them, and I felt that I was going to be speaking shortly after lunch, and I really didn't want to show them. But I did put together a montage of photographs which gives you some idea of the intensity and speed and force of impact that's going on between professional athletes. So to contextualize this a little bit, we've known quite a bit about this sort of thing for a while, and the earliest references were to something called the punch-drunk syndrome, which, as you would, obviously is related to boxing. And then doctors being doctors, they like a bit of Latin, so it became dementia pugilistica, but of course that's pretty much the same thing. And I thought, well, I'll look up my old medical school textbook to see what was known about it nearly 50 years ago. And they were talking about, the author of the book talks about punch drunkenness, leading to deterioration of personality, impairment of memory, dysarthria, tremor, Parkinsonian features, and ataxia. And we've just heard some reference to some of those symptoms. And what I thought was interesting is that in this book of nearly 50 years ago, there's reference to a range of neurological outcomes. So at the moment, the main story in town is about dementia, but actually there's a diversity of neurological outcomes. I'll probably come back to that a little bit as we go along. So it's not simple what CTE does. It's not just you get CTE and then you get something like Alzheimer's disease. Actually, you can get any one of a number of things. I thought I'd put some pictures in. So anyone tell me who this is? It is Steve Thompson, exactly. So he was on the telly recently. Bit more history. So, as I say, punch drunk comes from the boxing world. It was first used in a medical paper by an American pathologist called Martland in 1928. There's a picture of him. I put the picture in just because he's smoking a ciggy, actually, whilst doing a post-mortem. I thought it was wonderful. And then it got Latinized by one of his colleagues. The first person to use the term CTE, although we didn't abbreviate things in those days, was a guy called MacDonald Critchley, who was a neurologist at Queen Square in London. He also referred in a later book to chronic progressive traumatic encephalopathy. That's not caught on in quite the same way because the progressiveness is not always, may be there or may not be there. And then there have been various other seminal papers. One was by a neuropathologist called Corsellis, and was published in 1973, where he looked at, in a lot of detail, at the brains of about 8 former boxers. And it's also been recognised, punch-drunk syndrome and dementia pugilistica, CTE, has been recognised in other sports for quite a long time. And I remember as a medical student, going to a neurology case presentation where there was a guy who'd been a jump jockey. And the thing that I remember the most is they say, well, all the people that get this are jump jockeys. They're not National Hunt because, of course, jump jockeys are going over hedges and they fall off a lot more than flat racing jockeys. So he was a jump jockey, this guy, and he was all over the place. He was cognitively impaired. He was ataxic, and of course he wasn't any good at riding anymore, which put him a lot at risk if he was on the back of a horse. So to summarise my reading of the current situation is that the main interest in CTE has risen a lot because of sport, and because sport is a kind of multi-million-dollar enterprise. It's very high profile, and professional sport is, of course, followed by most of the population in some way. It's worth noting that the brain, of course, doesn't know what's kicking it. So it can be trauma from any other source, and other significant sources of cerebral trauma include military operations and domestic violence. So although the debate about concussion in elite sport has mainly focused on men so far, this doesn't mean that women sports people don't get concussed. They do. It's not so high profile at the moment, but also women with CTE, a lot of them have been exposed to domestic violence. And there is some attempt to describe the clinical features of CTE and to make distinctions from other neurodegenerative processes like Alzheimer's disease or vascular dementia. And there's increasing awareness, and particularly among athletes, among the parents of school children who play sport, about what are we exposing ourselves to, what are we letting ourselves in for, who's responsible for it, what duty of care do we have from our clubs, our schools, and so forth. And there are lots of issues about compensation, protection, prevention, and indeed possible rule changes in sport. So from the academic point of view, it's a really cool subject because there's masses of stuff about which we know, not a lot, and it's also changing. And so simply observing the way in which it's changing is actually legitimate science at the moment, let alone stopping it or preventing it or curing anything. Anyone know who this is? Thank you very much. Okay, so causes and risks. I'm aware that there's a talk coming up on risks, so I don't have to say too much about this, but it's difficult to say how much there is because of sampling bias. If you go to a concussion clinic, you are not seeing representatives of all the people that play that sport. It's difficult to find a population-based survey that's really telling you a lot about exposure to cerebral trauma. Early studies suggested about a fifth of boxers got punch-drunk syndrome, but what you have to remember is that early 20th, late 19th century, early 20th century boxing was rather different from boxing these days. People would do hundreds of fights. They would, they could be knocked out 50 times in their career. They would fight multiple opponents on one day. There was very little regulation. I don't think bouts were refereed, and so forth. So figures of this kind are not terribly useful, really. There are some big questions that we don't know the answers to. So can you get CTE after a single trauma? Is that enough to give you dementia subsequently? But it's more likely, and that most people that present to clinical attention with CTE, or possible CTE, have had repetitive injuries. If you're a professional rugby player, you won't have just been hit on the head once, you'll have been hit on the head a lot. If you're a central defender playing professional football, you will have headed the ball a lot, and you will have headed your opponents quite a lot as well, probably. And is it only episodes of kind of clinical concussion, whatever that means, as you were questioning what do we mean by concussion anyway? But is it just these episodes where people are kind of staggering all over the place, or is it in fact subconcussive trauma? Can the cumulative effects of that lead you to have CTE in the end? As I'm sure people are aware, athletes may be anxious to underreport the amount of concussion that they've experienced, because their livelihood, their reputation, their self-esteem depends on continuing to play and continuing to be successful, so they may not wish to report that they've had certain injuries. Measuring the severity of impacts is tricky. There are other people in the room who know a lot more about this than I do, but where you put the monitors may be crucial. But anything on the outside of the head, of course, is a proxy for what's actually happening to the brain itself. And then you may have individual factors, like some people may have greater genetic liability to develop dementia or sequelae after a brain injury than others. And so there may be different thresholds for the amount of cerebral trauma that you're able to tolerate before you develop clinically relevant symptoms. So clinical symptoms seem to be highly variable, as I've said. There are no generally agreed clinical criteria for diagnosis because of this heterogeneity of outcomes. So the cognitive disorders, but there may be motor disorders like Parkinson's or motor neuron disease, and also not just cognitive disorders, but you may see mood and behavior changes, and they can be very difficult to disentangle from the effect of your career as a sportsman ending. If your career comes to an end because of injury before you intended it to, you may well be quite emotionally traumatized by that. And so it's difficult to tell, well, what's CTE and what's the impact of the stress of the change of lifestyle. Another unknown is whether there's how much of a lag there is between having the exposure to the injury and the development of symptoms. And then, as I said, the clinical picture is confounded by the possibility of other variables, like a person might become depressed when they stop playing, they might start drinking, they might start abusing drugs or analgesics, or all sorts of things. And there may be profound life changes as well. So all of this can obscure the gradual evolution and appearance of clinical manifestations of CTE. And so this is just giving you a little bit more detail about some of these things. The impairments in cognitive function can be a sort of bit non-specific, so memory, executive functioning, processing speed. Behavior can be that people become suspicious or irritable or more impulsive. People may get low mood. There have been one or two high-profile cases, particularly in the States, of people of athletes killing themselves, but actually where people have looked with reasonable rigor, is there an increased suicide risk among ex-athletes? They don't find that. Actually, it's less than the general population, as far as you can tell. There's a variable age of onset of symptoms, and a suggestion that if people present earlier, let's say in their late 30s or early 40s, they may be more likely to have mood and behavior problems. And if they present later, 50s, 60s, they may be more likely to have cognitive problems. And then the progression is variable. And there are some attempts by some brave people to develop clinical criteria for diagnosis, but it's not going to be easy. Sorry? Oh, God, really? So this guy shot himself in the stomach, which meant that his brain could go to pathology, so that was pretty considerate. Neuroimaging is available, but a bit non-specific. They show less in the way of hippocampal change than people with Alzheimer's disease typically. And some scans. Who's this? Who's the guy on the deck, actually? Is it Fraser? Okay, thank you. So the pathology is a bit more worked out than the clinical picture, and often people have referred to it as a tauopathy. So tau is a protein that's derived from neurofibrillary tangles and is also increased in Alzheimer's disease. The problem is that this is made post-mortem, which is not great for live patients. Won't do that. Who's this? Yeah, so he's got a motor neuron disease like picture. So my approach to diagnosis is to think, well, you can have a reasonable stab at this. So if somebody comes along and they've got a history of exposure to head trauma, you should be thinking about it. And then if there are other things in the clinical picture that suggest that it's not Alzheimer's disease, like there's no family history and their age of onset is strikingly young, and they're medically fit otherwise, then it may well be CTE. So you can say that with a modicum of confidence, I think. It's worth thinking about, well, what's the clinical syndrome I'm dealing with? Is it dementia? Is it MCI, mild cognitive impairment? Is it something else? And you probably do investigations. You probably do an MRI anyway. Tau PET you might do if it's available. And treatment and management, there is virtually nothing on this specifically. People often get a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. They're on Alzheimer's treatments, but there's no good evidence of using these treatments in people with CTE and showing benefits. And there's starting to be quite good information available to people who have possible CTE. Who's this? Got you. He's Welsh, Alex Popham. So, a couple more slides. So I learned quite a lot doing this presentation, so I'm quite grateful. So this is what I learned, was that these things have been around for quite a long time. They have a very variable clinical presentation, have a variable course. There's more consensus about neuropathology. So actually most of the medical research being done about CT and dementia is actually from pathologists, not clinicians. Diagnosis becomes harder if people present at an older age because you're beginning to get to an age where other forms of dementia are commoner, and you say, well, it may have had some etiological significance, but maybe you just got Alzheimer's disease, you don't know. But certainly clinicians should routinely inquire about head trauma and sport history. It's a rapidly evolving subject. It's going to change. This is cutting edge. This is I like to keep up with the literature. This is this week's Beano. I don't know whether you can read that, but it says, this is Calamity James, my favourite character in the Beano. I love him. I guess it wouldn't hurt to try boxing. And of course, the rest of the strip is just brutal. I recommend it. The editor says I wouldn't be so sure about that, James. So what we don't know is we don't have a set of consistent clinical criteria. We don't know what the critical dose of trauma is. We don't know what individual risk factors there might be. We don't know the relative importance of subconcussions versus overt concussion and being unconscious. And there are some interesting questions like, well, how come, in the 1950s, they were playing with footballs that when they were wet weighed a ton? So why weren't there more footballers who played in the 1950s that got diagnosed with it? Why is it only footballers now, only rugby players now that are coming forward with it? And I've got some thoughts about that, but we're happy to discuss it in the discussion or at the tea break. I think this is fascinating. And there are some profound implications for sporting practice and for the rules of games. And indeed, some sports may disappear if they can't sort themselves out. And rightly so if they're killing people. And I'm not sure that Danny Blanchard definitely had Alzheimer's disease, but I don't know whether he had CTE or not, but he was a great footballer, so there you go. And that's not his stars, of course. Thank you very much.
Is the sound okay? Okay. My husband Dave was an internationally acclaimed footballer, known primarily as a centre half. He did start as a centre forward, but primarily as a centre half, coming late into the professional game at the age of 20 and a half. Amongst other things, he was renowned for his heading ability, which developed by extra heading practice. And he played until he was almost 39, a pro career of 19 years, playing over 700 professional matches, including England games. Dave sustained many head injuries and most likely thousands of subconcussive injuries, especially during training sessions. He was admitted to hospital with one particularly severe concussion. After football, he became a successful businessman, and his business acumen and ideas were astounding, having clients in blue-chip companies and even the FA. He even did a talk at the University of Sheffield on sponsorship. He regularly did a lot of charity work and also raised enormous amounts of money for disasters such as Hillsborough and Boxing Day tsunami. He was a great organizer with great intellect and never seemed fazed. But meeting him now would be hard to believe this was the same person. People often ask, when did you notice things? Is it just his memory? Well, dementia can be so insidious. About 10, 11 years ago, I noticed signs. Yes, short-term memory at first, but so much more. This continued for a couple of years or so, and the families noticed more too. So we eventually persuaded Dave to go to the doctors in 2014, remember, to access a brain scan to rule out a brain tumour, as he had changed so much. Dave was referred to the memory clinic. Subsequent CT scan followed. Result, no brain tumour. Diagnosis, probable Alzheimer's, handed leaflets, and little else advice-wise. It is at this point that many, given a dementia diagnosis, feel bereft, abandoned, failure to discuss access along with early support and interventions beyond diagnosis seems commonplace. And this is not just in sport, this is everybody. But planning is paramount, because no planning equals crisis. Frequency of reviews seem random and very much a postcode lottery. So, the Watsons researched big time. We found out more about connections between football and former players developing neurodegenerative diseases, NDD, often given the label Alzheimer's. We learnt more about CTE and other dementias. During this time, Dave had settled more, almost accepting his fate, bless him. Once given a diagnosis, it doesn't necessarily mean that all capacity is lost. We did not hide him away, but only a few of our close friends were told about the diagnosis. Then Dave still enjoyed attending matches, particularly England games at Wembley. He still does now, actually. It was there November 2019 when it became apparent we needed to let the fans know his diagnosis, because being asked to sign autographs was presenting issues. There were many fans outside Wembley, and Dave became quite anxious and overwhelmed. We discussed it and agreed that it would not only help Dave still be able to go to games, but also hopefully give other former players the courage to come out about their diagnoses, if he did. After all, it is not a dirty secret. 14th of February 2020, a statement was released through the Press Association, and the reaction was so supportive and moving. Manchester City invited us into the Royal Box at Wembley for the League Cup final. Everyone at Wembley was wonderful with him. An induction into the Hall of Fame at Sunderland went ahead, and the fans waiting for his autograph were so respectful and kind. Then COVID stopped football. Nothing much happened for months. Isolation. By early November 2020, we were ready to do an interview. A full-page article headlined, "The Forgotten England Captain," turned out to be the spark to light the fire to commence the campaigning and fight for the former players. Dave's thousands of fans were outraged that the PFA were doing very little to help. After all, they are the union for players, current and former. Dawn Astle, Chris Sutton mentioned us, Jim White interviewed us on TalkSport, and the BBC did a piece. The Mail launched their Big Dementia in Football campaign on the back of the initial interview. But let's be clear, we never really wanted the publicity, but realised we could use Dave's profile to help others. The fight and campaigning to help them began in earnest. Graham Satchell of the BBC Breakfast interviewed us, and our first thoughts were to highlight the connection between football and former players with dementia, so that they could access the help and care they deserved from the PFA and other stakeholders. Indeed, other former players did find the courage to make public their own situations. Why not? They shouldn't feel ashamed. The following year, Dave won a landmark ruling to have some of the brain injuries he'd sustained during his playing career recognised as industrial injuries, paving the way for footballers with dementia to receive benefits. With help, we compiled evidence of 10 serious head injuries, and all 10 cases were deemed by the IIDB to be industrial accidents. We hope more than anything that this has set a precedent for others to seek help. By now, Dave was diagnosed with probable CTE as well as probable Alzheimer's. Glasgow University research studies had concluded that former centre-backs were 5 times more likely than the wider population to develop dementia. December 21, Boston University in the USA released a statement regarding research into the possibility of diagnosing CTE in vivo, as they had found that participants diagnosed with CTE post-mortem were nearly 7 times more likely to have a cavum septum pellucidum, CSP. Our daughter Gemma, based in the USA, had researched CSP, having read on Dave's scan reports that there was incidental CSP. Turns out that others in the USA seeing Dave's scans said that Dave had one of the largest tears in his septum pellucidum they had ever seen, CSP. The scan had also been seen by other neurologists and eminent specialists, not only in the States, but here in the UK, who said there was marked deterioration too between the first scan and the second 4 years later. It just goes to show that scans are only as good as the person reading them and their knowledge of specifics. Incidental CSP does not seem the right adjective. Diagnosis in vivo will mean players can make informed decisions whether to continue playing football, that is. We would love that players could have scans at the beginning of each season, midway through, and certainly after head injuries incidents to see if there is any change in the brain. If a player finds out there could be a problem, they could decide, along with their families, whether to continue playing, especially if in their early 30s. They most likely would stop, not go on until late 30s as my husband did. 39, remember. 5 more years of extra pounding his head in training. 5 more years of subconcussive exposure, 5 more years of head injuries requiring stitches and even hospitalization. Diagnosis in vivo would mean a game changer. In 2021, after Gordon Taylor finally left the PFA, I contacted the new CEO, Maheta Malango, and he was very receptive of my suggestions around the PFA, improving care and assistance for players with NDD. We struck up quite a good working relationship, but I steadfastly remained independent and at times critical. At last, we had someone at our guys' union wanting to fight for the former players and their families. Subsequently, the NDD department was formed, and I agreed to formalise and make public the role I had been undertaking on a pro bono basis by my insistence, and I was given the title of Independent PFA Consultant. Through my campaigning, Gemma and I were asked to contribute to a roundtable strategy meeting regarding brain health organised by the HIPPO group, which is the Head Injury Policy Oversight Group, made up of the stakeholders being the FA, the PL, the EFL, the PFA and the LMA. This group has been and continued to work to develop a brain health action plan focusing on research, education and awareness, and supporting players. Part of this ongoing project is the Advanced Brain Health Clinic, which partners with the RFU and Premier Rugby, which was started in January 2019 by the Imperial College, London, ICL and UCL. And having been focusing on rugby players, now they are looking at footballers in the age range 35 to 55, or former football players, of course. Of course, locally, there has been the Nottingham University focus study on footballers, and work is ongoing with the Sports Technology Institute at Loughborough University, and I understand there has been studies here at Nottingham Trent Uni with women's sport, the WSL and Women's Championship. We must remember that as dramatic head injuries are on the pitch in matches, they are just the tip of the iceberg. Much of the damage done to the brain is the day-in, day-out training regime, leading to possible subconcussive injuries. Much has also been said about the old leather balls and the difference to today's. And it's said modern players won't have the same issues because the modern balls don't absorb water the same. Well, hey everybody, recent research is showing that is not the case, because even though the modern balls are only marginally lighter because of the coating and what they are made of, they travel through the air with greater velocity, therefore make contact with the players with comparable impact. So it's false for modern players to think they'll be all right heading the ball. After research on this impact during training and games, the PL recently produced guidelines to limit high force headers to 10 per week. If this is being implemented by coaching staff remains to be seen. I have been active in lobbying for financial contributions from the main stakeholders for a care fund for former players with football-related dementias for support. I also assisted in the development of a survey to PFA members to gather information to support this. The response was almost overwhelming, and not just from worried old guys, but some in their 50s and 40s, and some women footballers too. Things have actually come a long way over the last 12, 15 months since the new CEO at the PFA took up office. Dave and I knew we couldn't do anything about the road we are going down now, but we could sure as hell try to make life a little easier for the families who hadn't got a voice, and try to ensure that our own descendants were not put at the same risk. So I'm quite optimistic about some things. The industry-wide fund I just mentioned, which I first discussed over a year ago, is almost ready to go. Rightly so that the PL, EFL and FA should contribute. My husband sustained head injuries playing for England and the old Football League, all divisions. The success of the PL and others now, and the wealth generated in football, was built on the legacy of our former players. Please don't interpret any of this as me boasting. The Watsons seem to have a voice, and our aim is just to make a difference for others. In addition to advising the PFA and wider campaigning, I set up a self-help group on Zoom for former WAGs, Well, yes, I am an original wag. Just the wags, no other family members. We are walking along the same path 24/7. We keep things from our children to protect them and preserve some semblance of their father, the head of the family. We carry the burden of being the one who makes decisions that before would have been made together with our partners. We are the ones who have lost our husbands, our soulmates, and even though physically they resemble our guys, they are not the men we have lived and loved for decades. We have become their mothers. None of us envisioned our lives together ending like this, on a journey we would not have taken by choice. It is truly heartbreaking. This is where some of you come in. Knowledge is powerful. Informed decisions will prevent heartache for others in the future. Educate and spread the word. Sport can do so much good, but concussions in sport can ultimately take away so much. And I don't know whether I've gone over, but that's it.
Thank you, Christopher, and thanks for organising this session. So I've been working in concussion for about 8 years now, and I'm really probably, my background is more of a lab-based scientist, and we were the first lab to show that you get these electrophysiological changes when hitting a football. But my journey in working in this area has led me to working directly with clubs, seen a lot of the issues, working with a lot of clinicians, and more recently I got appointed as an advisor to DCMS and how we're moving forward. So the talk I've prepared is not so much going into the nitty-gritty data, it's more probably about a little bit of the sort of bigger picture. So we talked about Steve Thompson earlier, and there was a documentary, a film done a couple of weeks ago. If you've not seen it, I urge you to see it. It is quite upsetting. So just a sort of summary. So as we know, we've got growing concern about this. And this is, this degeneration, it's shown as almost secondary to participation in sort of impact sports. And we spoke about it earlier, development of CTE, and I'll talk a bit later. As we said, you can only truly diagnose it at an autopsy, which isn't particularly helpful for us right now. So the focus was, Prof. Denning said earlier, originally boxing, but it's now expanded to other contact sports, so rugby, NFL, football. And it is now described as a public health issue. As I mentioned, I've been working in this area for about 8 years. And I remember right at the start, we put in multiple applications for research funding, funding bodies like the MRC, even World Rugby. And we were always knocked back. And a lot of it was just, we were just told it was nothing wrong with the science, it was just considered low priority. And a lot of the impression we had was the fact that, well, it's sport, you choose to do it. Whereas you're competing for funding against, say, childhood cancer, the childhood cancer is always going to come up against you. But it has now changed. The MRC are now starting to fund projects. They funded Birmingham stuff on salivary microRNAs. I'm now involved with a massive project, again with Birmingham, funded by the MOD for both civilians and military personnel. So it is now been recognized as this issue that we can't just ignore. So can you just play that, please? Is that possible? Does that play? So just a sort of a visual to show what goes on. And the brain sits within the skull, within this cerebral spinal fluid. So every time it sort of rocks, it then bashes against the head. And often this is why, and you get different types of impacts, linear, rotational. And this is where, say with NFL, just because you're wearing a helmet doesn't stop this effect. Okay, so in many ways, sorry, if you can just go back to the slide, please, sorry. And in many ways, with things like NFL, what they have shown is they actually use the helmet as a weapon. So they actually go in and use that, so you end up exacerbating this effect. So the irony of it is, the helmet, you could argue, actually makes it worse. Sorry, thank you. If you could just go back to the slides. So one of the main concerns is, or one concern more acutely, is the second impact syndrome. So this is where you have this impact, you get the edema, the player is not removed from play, they continue playing, and then they get another hit, and that can be fatal, because then you get complete cellular shutdown. And back in 2013, there's this tragic case of Ben Robinson from Northern Ireland, who was apparently the best player on the field that day. And literally the referee was holding the guy at the hand, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And the referee was from the club that Ben was from. And he carried on playing, got another hit, and I think 3 hours later he was dead. His father has now dedicated his whole life to campaigning for this. He does a fantastic job. And if you're interested, he's got a Twitter handle called Ben Robinson. And he's just been doing a brilliant job and is just constantly putting on the pressure and creating awareness. And can you just play that, please? So part here, you should be able to see it. You get first hit, down, and then I think, in absence of the soundtrack, okay, it's not going to work, so I thought the sound would come through. We'll leave that, forget that. I'm fairly short on time, don't worry. But I think it's basically the same player goes down again, and yeah, okay, thank you. We'll stop there. So I thought we'll get sound. It's fine. I think you get it. So, certainly in Scotland, largely through Peter Robinson, Ben Robinson's father, there's a big campaign called "If in Doubt, Sit Them Out," which is a very clean campaign and as we said before, we don't know yet really what concussion is. And in fact, concussion has almost been likened to what TB was 100 years ago, when it was just known as the consumption, because clinically we didn't know what was causing it. And that is where we're kind of at with it. Now, we saw earlier some of the obvious symptoms, but with this sort of campaign, it's about awareness for everyone. So it's awareness for the coach, it's for other players to see if they have any of these symptoms, and they can then get removed from play. Easier said than done when you've got, for example, under 18-year-olds, once they have this, they then cannot return to play for 23 days. Causes a lot of issues. And a lot of people don't want to be off for 23 days, quite understandably. Often the coach doesn't want to be, the player doesn't want to be, the parent doesn't want to be. It's an absolute pain. So a lot of the times it's just like, oh, it wasn't really, it was just a head knock. It's fine, don't worry about that. We've even had issues, some of the clubs I've been working with, and what you call, if a player goes unconscious, you call that a red flag. So it's a red flag, straight to A&E. No ifs, no buts, straight to A&E. The doctors will scan them, check them over, and then they might say, okay, just take it easy for a week and then go back. So then the parent will go then with wee Johnny back to the rugby club a week later, and the coach goes, what is he doing here? He had a concussion a week ago. Well, the doctor said it's fine. No, it's 23 days. And the parent goes, so you're telling me you know more than the doctor does about concussion? And he says, no, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is we're mandated to these guidelines, and if you don't like it, you probably need to take it up with the head chief medical officer, James Robson. So this is the issue we've got. We've got guidelines, and definitely better than nothing, but adherence still a major issue. So we talked about a bit earlier, concussion, as we say, you've got visible symptoms removed from the field of play. What sometimes you could argue is more sinister is a subconcussive. So this is where you don't get any visible symptoms. And this is where you are getting these repeated head impacts. And heading a football is one good example of that. And since a lot of our work, I often get contacted by ex-players, concerned players. And I'll talk a bit about the impacts of anxiety. But I do remember one example. There was a retired player been diagnosed early onset dementia. And he played for Birmingham City for 2 years as a midfield defender. And he said for half an hour every day, the drill was the ball get hoofed up in the air, and he had to return it as far as he could. And he said by the end of it, he was feeling dizzy, And by the evening, he was getting headaches. I was like, did you not think to say that to anyone? He says, I wouldn't dare, I'll get dropped. So I think this is just typical of what went on. You can see there, we did a documentary, which is on BBC, called Alan Shearer, Dementia, Football and Me, a few years back. And he told us that they used to do drills, probably about 100 a session. That's what he was doing. So it was excessive. Now, obviously, one of the ways, real-time monitoring, there's been a number of technologies being tested out. A lot of work being done on gum shields. Slight challenges, obviously, footballers don't wear gum shields. They're expensive, about almost £1,000 a pop. And if, like my son, you go through about 6 a season, so that's never going to happen. So it's about looking at affordable technologies, so grassroots sports, we can start to look at the amount of impacts they're getting. And then ideally, it'd be to be able to then have safe limits. So you know them when someone, depending on how old they are, if they're male, female, you have an idea of the limit that they should have and then remove them. There's other technologies we're looking at, in-ear sensors, even like nasal strips, a lot of stuff going on. So yeah, so this is the sort of things we're going through as we speak. Okay, and as I said, I mentioned about that earlier. Okay, so last year we had the DCMS report, and it was quite damning, if I'm honest, to the sort of the football authorities. And I don't know if you've seen this, but it's certainly quite a sobering read. And this is the main part here, is that sport has been allowed to mark its own homework. And this is where the governing bodies have been coming to far greater scrutiny. And we heard there earlier, we've had these limits imposed, 10 headers in a week, but it's a very blunt instrument. And you've got then this tension between coach and practice. If you want to get good at a core skill, how do you do that? You do it again and again and again. So suddenly then a coach is thinking, oh, I can't do any more than 10. Do they adhere to that? We don't know. Okay, so I think we've got a long, long way to go. So again, it's just this delegation, so it's how we move forward on that. So there's been a number of sort of direction on this, and there's been a big institute set up at Oxford University to deal with that. But there's still a lot we don't know, and maybe there's a lot of concern, particularly with some of the lawsuits that are coming our way. Okay, so there are the key findings and recommendations. And as I say, it still doesn't give us a whole lot to go on. And it's looking about these standard definitions for concussion. As we said before, we didn't really know what concussion is yet. So we've got a long road to travel. Okay, I won't go into too much detail here because I'm conscious of time, but you can see it's all there. Okay, so you've got things like medical officer, attendance, and all the rest of it. Okay, so recent changes. We said there earlier, heading guidance, 10 clubs, you can see there, and again, it's fairly loose as we speak. And rugby contact training limited to 15 minutes is what's been gone on. And this has happened more recently in England. I was interviewed by Nigel Farage on GB News. I knew what was happening. This is going to be the mantra of, oh, this is Cottonmore society. Why can't kids do what they used to be? You know, this is the changing nature. So I had to put this case of why it is necessary in the light of the evidence we're seeing in front of us. But as I say, we do have these challenges that, and what I've tended to find in this area of research is you do have a camp of concussion deniers, and then you've got obviously the other camp, which may be just a bit too evangelical. One of my colleagues was suggesting that every football that gets sold should come with a health warning. And I was like, oh, come on, it's a football. Kids just want to go out and kick it around and have exercise. So it's about finding the appropriate ground for this. So we did this documentary in 2016. There's a field study, as mentioned earlier, Willie Stewart in Glasgow. There's changes in policy banning heading, and so we've got more funding streams through these various funding bodies, and there is great awareness, by the public. So I think things that are starting to move forward, and we've got this government intervention of trying to see where we're at. Now, what's not moved forward, I said earlier, very difficult compliance to protocols, particularly grassroots, and even we need to get more themes, global UKRI calls coming up. What I do say is potentially a bit of issue is media sensationalism, and we do get this problem with increasing anxiety, and it says it's about a happy medium. And you do get now even parents not wanting the school kids to go and play football, which is tragic. You know, football's a great game. I want to see kids out there having fun, being excellent, you know, and you've always got, to an extent, to discuss the cost-benefit relationship of sport. And now, you can argue at the one end of the spectrum, you've got boxing. Now, would I want my son to box? Absolutely no way. Would I want him to box? No chance. But if you take some kid from some really, really deprived community where drug dealing and crime is absolutely rife, and maybe the benefits of being a boxer outweigh the risks of the life course they could embark upon. So I think there's a fairly sort of wide discussion to be had here. Okay, so yeah, elite contact sport athletes, they do have greater exposure, they're fitter, they're stronger, they're heavier. You know, the impacts they have is a lot higher. And, you know, I think there is a bit of double standards. I saw there the grassroots. If you've got these symptoms, it should be, away you go, 23 days if you're a kid, it's a little bit less, 14 days if you're an adult, and that's it. Where somehow a medic can, within the space of 10 minutes, decide that they can go back on or not. And it's a very, very blunt tool. So I think there is a bit of double standards going on there. Okay, again, I'm conscious of time. I won't go into that because that was covered a bit earlier, but you've got all these sort of red flags of getting them to A&E ASAP. And then you've got some of the claims that are going on. It's sort of pre-senile dementia. And this is where you get a consultant neurologist, and it's looking at the permanent clinical loss of ability to do some of the following. But the point of it is it's got to be progressive. It's a progressive degeneration. It's remembering, reasoning, perceived understanding. Now, the difficulty with this is that once an ex-player has had this diagnosis, there's no going back from that. It's not like type 2 diabetes, potentially you can reverse it. There's no going back from that diagnosis. And the difficulty of that, it then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if you have that diagnosis, chances are you may get a bit depressed, they may start drinking more, it then becomes a downward spiral. Okay? So that's the difficulty. And as I said, I get contacted by a number of ex-players, and they want me to come and assess them in our labs. And obviously I'm saying, well, I'm not sure that's a good idea. If you're concerned, go see your GP. But the problem is, often if they're anxious, the anxiety will cause cognitive deficits. So they may go to the GP, they're worried, the GP then may refer them to the neurologist, but in some of the cognitive tests they have, there may be cognitive gaps, but that could be driven more by the anxiety as opposed to actually CTE. Couple minutes. So, and there's some data to support that, which I've just pulled up there, about how anxiety can affect cognition. And you've got some of the uncontrollable risk factors, obviously age, family history, Down syndrome. And then some of the modifiable ones are all these. So these are all modifiable. And in fact, in Scotland, they've actually got a brain clinic for retired Scotland internationals. I think it's a bit gimmicky, to be honest with you. And a lot of it is just looking at these risk factors to see how they can modify any of these so you reduce the overall chances. Okay, again, so how much longer have we got? 30 seconds, right, okay. So I won't go through, so I'll probably answer it. We spoke about CTE, tau deposits in the brain. Let's say this is largely an autopsy. And then a lot of it's, but what you have is this diffuse axonal injury. This is the shearing of these neurons. So it's about how we can measure that. There's been some promising MRI techniques for this, diffuse and tensor imaging, where you're looking at fluid shifts. But there's quite a way to go for that. It's really expensive, and it's how you calibrate it across different labs and institutions. So, as I say, it's about how we can start to diagnose it before someone dies. And there's also biomarkers, and that's part of the work we're doing with the big MOD project, so looking at how some of these might relate to that. Okay, so blood biomarkers might be able to identify DAE, and that might help. And there still is this link to be established. And even in the Glasgow study, the field study, they showed 3.5 times more likely to get neurodegenerative disorders. But where the context gets missed a bit is that football playing group also lived on average 2 years longer. So I think it's getting a better context here. So there's still quite a bit of work to be done there. So the actual evidence does suggest that this association is there. I think there's overwhelming support for that. And my key is how you reduce player risk, not sport participation. I don't want kids not playing rugby and football. That's not the way to go. Oops, I'll just put it there. And that's me, sorry.
Next up is Reem, who's one of my PhD students. Now, in the course of Reem's project, she's actually taken some hits to the head, as I did in my research. That's actually caused some kind of issues with aphasia. So Reem's going to try and get through this talk, but it is going to be possibly a little bit of a struggle. Reem, over to you.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Chris. So today I'll be talking to you about fighters' understanding of concussion. So this study is part of one of the studies I've done as part of my PhD project that looks at largely looks at how fighters think about, understand and manage their experiences with risk, pain and injury. One of the many reasons why I wanted to focus on concussion was that the fighters that I spoke to in these conversations, they almost always were very descriptive in describing their experiences with concussion symptoms, but at the same time did not think that it was concussion, or even more so did not associate it with that. So I was interested in exploring this tension within their understanding of the condition a bit further. So what I'll do now is just talk you through some of the main findings of this. So one of the key findings is that the fighters' understanding of concussion was transient. What I mean by this is that they initially were confident, they have this initial certainty of what they thought a concussion was, but then it quickly shifted to uncertainty once they started to realize the gaps in their own knowledge about the condition, and the more they talked about it. I guess what's important here is that I'm not here to come and say, oh, fighters don't know what a concussion is. Of course they don't. I'm not expecting them to know that, as shown in the other talks. Even doctors still struggle to this day to know what it is exactly. What I'm interested here specifically is the source of knowledge the source of this certainty, this initial certainty that the fighters make, that makes the fighters certain that they have not had a concussion. Most of the conversations I had with the fighters where they talked about their personal experiences in relation to concussion revolved around keeping their guard up, protecting their head, surviving the round. They hardly ever spoke about their health in that sense. So what this shows is that their understanding of concussion was largely based on performance rather than their health and well-being more broadly. So these performance-orientated ideas are passed on to them by the coaches, which were key in providing them with, that. What lay medical certainty does is that it provides, it's built on technical pointers and specific practices that are specifically there to help fighters cope with potential blows to the head inside the ring. And the fighters believed that being involved in such practices sort of prevented them from sustaining further injury. And the reason why they favored this sort of advice, this lay medical certainty, is that it provided them an explanation of what happened, and at the same time gave them instructions on what to do in order to prevent it from happening in the future. But most importantly, it meant that they could continue to compete. So these ideas, this idea of certainty and this confidence was the basis from which fighters normalized the concussions as a normal part of the sport. Now, yes, it did give them this confidence in order to sort of challenge the physicality of head injuries, but then it did not didn't help them think through the consequences of such actions outside of the ring and into their lives more broadly. This brought about feelings of uncertainty. What I mean here is that this was specifically evident in examples where I was asking the fighters to speak to me about the long-term side effects of concussions. They were generally aware about them, but they often dismissed them once they started to feel feelings of uncertainty because they didn't know they were not well equipped to speak about it. Instead, they deflected it and spoke about the positive aspects of the sport. I think I want to park it here if that's okay, but just to say one more thing. I remember when I submitted this paper for review, one of the reviewers asked me, so what, why is this important? And I guess the reason why is that, well, one of the reasons is that most of the work that looks at athletes, specifically fighters' understandings of concussion, focuses on fighter education as part of a working solution, regardless of the findings. This is based on the assumption that if fighters would know about concussion, they're less likely to engage in health compromising behaviors. But then what this really tiny bit of the study shows is that you cannot rely on these simple solutions. This issue is far more complex, so you cannot rely on these simple solutions in order to solve complicated problems like that.
So yeah, I'm Debbie. As Chris has introduced me, I'm one of his PhD students. My project's a little different. I'm looking at women's sport, specifically medical regulation and support. So the thoughts and ideas I'm just going to go through in my presentation is ideas that have come through the data that I've been collecting over the last year, and I'm currently in the process of writing a paper with Chris looking at women's sport and injuries. So the data I collected is female athletes in the UK, ranging from grassroots through to elite level performers. So hopefully press it the right way. So the background that I looked at for my study centred around 5 main areas. This made up the lit review that I wrote as part of my project proposal for my PhD. With a background in the male preserve and looking at all the dimensions that then fed into that for women's sport. So things like the traditional exclusion of women in medicine and how that can relate to also sort of the current sort of underrepresentation of women in sports and exercise science research, and how this in turn can add on to the experiences that women have in sport and medicine and sort of the unique environment that's created within women's sport. And with increased professionalisation and increased participation over the last few years of women's sport, how all these things are coming together in, as we've termed it, a perfect storm. So within the study, I asked women about the injuries they'd either encountered and the injuries that they were concerned to them within their sport. And obviously we're here talking about concussions. These are a few of the mentions of concussion that came through in the study. So despite women highlighting that concussion and head injury was a concern of theirs when competing, a lot of them had a nonchalant attitude towards head injuries. And you can see there the concussion is my standard injury, which was one that was quite stark for us in going through this. So this sort of attitude towards injury and self-care was replicated throughout the study with women and injuries, and there was a real tendency for women to employ a variety of approaches to dealing with their injuries and pain when taking part in sport. So the findings of the study covered a few things. We've sort of looked at the work of Charlesworth and Young and Elizabeth Pike, and we found sort of across the same things, that women are conforming to the same health compromising behaviours as male athletes in those that we interviewed. There was a lack of medical care generally in women's sport, and there was an over-reliance on your typical traditional pitch side first aid kit, helping each other out and bundling someone off to hospital. And therefore taking advantage of either self-funded care or NHS for treatment, which a number of female athletes related back to if you wanted swift care, you had to pay for it. We also found a reliance in team doctoring, and this is a term that Reem and Chris have worked on, and it's the reliance on of team members, coaches, and people within an athlete's immediate sport net for medical knowledge and information and support. So we found this with women. There was a heavy reliance on females within predominantly team sports, where it was almost a boastable fact that you had an A&E nurse as a member of your team, or you had a doctor and you'd switched it out this season for a physio who could help on the pitch side. There was a lot of, we've got a first aid kit, but we've got a physio that knows how to use it. So what could this mean for women in sport? So we've looked at sort of the need to critically consider in which way women athletes are supported in terms of medical support at a number of levels, the medical provision for grassroots through to elite level, and the increased opportunities in women's sport, also increasing the risk of harm. So we've said we're starting to look at suggestions for what could need to be done to make women's sport safer. And in this sort of the poorly stocked tokenistic first aid kits, over reliance on each other for that support, and how women can be supported in their medical choices. And obviously this comes into specific injuries such as concussion, and as Reem's already suggested, it's not just about education. So for me personally, in my project, I'm sticking with researching women's sport. I'm currently working on a study looking at women on the water. So I am a competitive dinghy sailor, so I've got access to women in dinghy, keelboat, yacht racing, windsurfing and kite surfing, where there's quite a difference in sort of the medical supervision available. So hopefully, with some of the responses that have come through this study and the data I'm currently collecting, I'm hoping to look further at concussion in women's sport. So that is me.
Thank you, everybody, for coming along today. There comes a stage at any academic meeting where the symptoms of concussion, like being dazed and confused, irritable and sleepy, start to be manifest in the audience in front of you. And I think that's why Chris asked me to speak today at the end of this. It's also very nice of him to give me quite as much time as I might have, as we're running a bit early. Okay, so this is an area that I've been working in for nearly 20 years. And I had no idea that it was going to become the area that it ultimately did. But the first study that I did was related to a project we were doing about injuries in professional rugby union around 2000 to 2001, first publication in 2002. And what was striking was the mayhem, the uncertainty, as Reem has talked about, but also, as Sahil talked about, in terms of the diagnosis. What is concussion? How do we work with it? And for that reason, I find concussion a really interesting area that's ripe for social scientists to come in. And it's quite a challenge for social scientists to work, I think, in this area, which is primarily driven by biomedical science. But it's a very interesting challenge for those very reasons. It's interesting for us, I think, partly because of what we've heard described as the vague or what has been described as the vague and heterogeneous symptoms of concussion. There are so many diverse symptoms of concussion, and we don't understand how they all join up or whether they are the same thing. It's feasible to think that in 50 years' time or so, we might have a very different understanding of what we're now calling concussion as, in fact, 7, 8, 9, 10 separate conditions. It's a nice area for social scientists to go into because of the relatively limited scientific understanding. So when I refer to that, I'm thinking particularly in terms of diagnosis. It's really hard to diagnose concussion. The medical consensus statements call it the most complex issue to manage within professional sport. But if anybody's got a Twitter account, you'll know that it's actually a very easy thing to diagnose, and anybody feels that they can do it from seeing a few clips on the television. So it's that kind of conflict between lay understanding, as we've just heard, and the medical understanding is very interesting, I think, for a sociologist to step into. Thirdly, it's interesting because of the conflation of issues. We've talked today about concussion, we've talked today about CTE, we've talked very briefly about second impact syndrome. But those kind of things tend to be researched in medical science in their silos. And one of the things that I think social scientists can offer is an overview or trying to bring those different areas together. Fourthly, one of the things that makes it interesting is in terms of the uncertainty over this longer term neurocognitive decline, as I call it here, or neurodegenerative diseases. That is not to say that the compelling evidence that certain cohorts of elite athletes clearly have higher or pronounced rates of dementia and or CTE. But what we don't know yet is, and I was going to ask this question to Tom about causality, when we think about causality of other forms of dementia, we normally group them as multiple causes. We don't tend to identify a single cause. And the narrative around sport is about a monocausal impact, if you'll pardon the pun, in terms of the diagnosis of dementia. And we also don't know about what leads to CTE, as Tom explained. So what is it? Is it the concussive impacts? Is it the subconcussive impacts? And so on. We've heard about this increasingly becoming a public health concern, and anything which is a public health intervention inevitably means that we need to take the evidence that we assemble in the laboratory, the efficacy evidence that we have of what works under laboratory conditions, into the real world, the effectiveness evidence. And for that kind of translation, we need a broader base of disciplines to have an input. And Angus mentioned the debates often around that appear on media and social media. I think we have to deal with them, and I think we have to embrace them. It's only 3 years ago that Willie Stewart was being accused of being a CTE denier on Twitter, following the publication of an article in the Lancet Neurology, where he said we needed some caution in talking about CTE. And now clearly he's one of the leading researchers and has assembled the most definitive evidence about CTE within British professional sport. I think there's been some certain areas of progress. This first quote here from McCrory et al. Do people recognise the name McCrory? A few nodding their heads. There's been a lot of discussion about Paul McCrory recently and his role both as editor of the British Journal of Sports Medicine and in developing and leading the concussion consensus statements. This, I believe, is not something which he plagiarised, which is increasingly unique, but it is probably self-plagiarism, because I think this was repeated in earlier consensus statements, but it's not been flagged up yet. But in those consensus statements, there was an explicit recognition that we needed to address socio-cultural factors if we were going to understand progress in the field. There's also been the development of lots of calls for cultural change, and I'll talk a bit more about those later on in the presentation. But talk about cultural change pricks my ears as a sociologist, because I feel that culture is a domain that belongs primarily to us and is shared with other disciplines. So we have an input there. Other areas of progress that has been mentioned, the next concussion consensus statement there's a meeting tomorrow and over the weekend, and the 6th statement will be produced early in the new year. And what's interesting about that is how they've revised the scientific committee, so that there are now 4 members of the scientific committee, one of whom is an ethicist of sports medicine, Mike McNamee from Swansea University. So there's a very clear shift to broadening the agenda here. And I think there's certainly areas of progress, and we've heard reference to Adam White. a sociologist who has been very active in terms of forwarding a concussion agenda and is now working more centrally in the sports industry to address these issues. I think that's part of the what we need to achieve and how we need to go forward as social scientists working in this area. A few years ago, I wrote a paper about a concussion in sport and what was called public sociology, or Mike Burraway, the president of the American Sociological Association a few years ago, talked about the different things that sociologists ought to be trying to do, either talking to their own profession, talking about sociology to develop new tools and theories and methods to develop our understanding of the world, whether we work largely for governments and for forwarding policy agendas. But also he said specifically about public sociology, and I think that's where our work on concussion is really important. And I'm conscious that as somebody who lectures to undergraduate students, my first public is those students. And working at Loughborough University, a huge number of those take part in sport frequently. And so how does my research inform their approach to concussion? So I think we need to expand what we do and think as well about the way in which we do it, and we can learn from other areas here. I'm going to go over this quite quickly as it's a bit sociology heavy, but for those who are interested, if you look at the way medical sociology has dealt with these issues in the past, initially we have a discipline called medical sociology, which uses sociology to help medical practitioners do a better job. So it's often about managing patients. But as that discipline develops, it becomes more critical, and sociologists start to question what medicine is doing. And I think that's something that we really need to do around the concussion agenda. And eventually that discipline or subdiscipline morphs into the sociology of health and illness, to recognise that what's actually experienced in terms of medical aspects is much broader. It happens at home. A wonderful statistic I once heard was that for every formal medical consultation that takes place, there are 11 or 12 lay medical consultations which take place, for instance, in the home or with partners or with other people, as we talk about our medical issues with other people. So it's much broader. So as a sociologist of sport and somebody who wants to forward the sociology of sport, there's a tightrope to be walked here in terms of developing things which appeal to sociologists and developing things which appeal and feed into the more formal concussion agenda that's biomedically dominated. In thinking how I was going to approach this presentation, I stumbled across a book chapter that I'd written sometime before lockdown and COVID, and so I'd completely forgotten about it. And in the conclusion of that, book chapter, I developed this table, and it's based on the work of Stefan Timmermans, who was the sociology editor of Social Science and Medicine, so one of the strongest journals in the area. And he talked about the specific things that qualitative health sociologists should be looking at. And he came up with a typology of 7 areas that this group of researchers could forward in a more advanced and nuanced and sophisticated way compared to others. I came up with a kind of, I thought about how you might apply all of those 7 to the area of concussion. And I'm grateful that Chris is going to forward these slides so that you don't have to read that now. And I'm going to draw on some of these 7 down the side, I think 3 of them in the time that I have remaining, so I can make it much more applied to the concussion research and bring it to life to some extent. I think the first thing we need to do is to think about, why is concussion an issue? How has this been constructed as a social issue? It's not simply the case that the social issues that we confront in society are the most urgent and ethically compelling things. There are social processes which lead to this. And as we saw earlier, actually, the evidence about CTE has been long-standing. We've known this for ages and ages, particularly in terms of boxing. So why were we not interested about brain injuries in boxers, and we are now much more interested in brain injuries of footballers, rugby players, but also broader groups or broader demographics who are affected by this concussion crisis? We need to think about how medicine has encroached or become more widespread in the field of sport, how the reach of medical personnel, but also medical understandings of why we do sport and how we do sport have grown. We need to think about our own conceptions of health and what health means to us. Once upon a time, health was not feeling ill, but now it's something which is a much more ongoing process that we are urged to work at through our lives. And you only have to look at kind of guidelines of physical activity to see how ubiquitous they are, how they stretch across our whole lifespan and all the things that we do. But we also have to recognise that actually this concern about concussion has grown up in relationship to a broader brain culture in society. So it's no coincidence, I don't think, that the diagnosis of CTE in Mike Webster, the first NFL player to be diagnosed with CTE, took place in the same year that President Bush launched a mental health awareness campaign in America and a mental health awareness review. We are interested in these issues of brain health across a whole range of issues in society. This is the frontiers of medicine. So it's no surprise, really, that at this point in time we should be interested in brain health within sport. I think there are things which are happening in sport which explain why we've come to this point. For many years, sports have been what has been called dominant self-regulators. They've been judged to be the people who should look after their own affairs. But that's declining. That's no longer the case, as we've seen with the DCMS, but as we've seen, for instance, with the policing of performance-enhancing drugs in sport. People are increasingly critical of organisations like the FA, the PFA, and the Premier League for their commercial motives. We heard the term commodities earlier to describe players, and that is clearly one critique of the way these bodies treat the people who make the money for them, essentially. I think one of the reasons why we're interested in concussion and CTE and dementia now is linked to our growing nostalgia in sport and the celebrity culture, which means that we are now interested in old players through their lifespan. And so much attention focused on the '66 World Cup winning team. And that's partly because they became celebrities and we followed them into old age in a way that we haven't done with previous generations of sports people. And I think another interesting underlying concept here is national identity. It's interesting that the sports in which these issues are most pronounced are also the national sports of various countries. American football, Australian rules football, rugby union in New Zealand. And I think there's a whole range of changes in the way we treat children and respond to childhood that fuel our concerns about concussion. So if you look at the American Concussion Legacy Foundation, that's so centrally depicted about the harm that is being done to children's brains. And there's a conflation here of people driving children into sport because they think it's good for them and being particularly concerned about their health. It's a very good job. I had more time than you'd originally allotted. So in terms of those 7 areas, a second one that we can look at is what I think sociology can contribute is to examine how social relations mediate medical interventions. And I've referred to the issue of cultural change previously, and I think that is an area which is one both prominent in the narratives about what we're doing about concussion, but also one which is at the foreground of what sociologists do. My concern at the moment is that most of the drive around cultural change is psychologically driven. And I think that's a mistake. This quote kind of epitomises how it's focused on changing awareness, changing attitudes, and therefore hoping for a change in behaviour. But behaviour is structured by much more than that. So we need to look at longer term ongoing processes. Cultural change is not going to happen overnight. And we need to recognise that cultural change involves both those psychologically oriented elements, but as well as structural, cultural aspects of the sport, of the way the sport is organised. And we need to recognise that those structural aspects are likely to take longer to change and are more difficult to change than those psychological aspects. And the call for this really stems from a huge amount of research in the United States, which has used a whole range of educational intervention studies, which have ultimately shown very little impact on behaviour. So a lot of time and money has been invested in providing education to athletes about what they do with concussion, and what we found is that actually most of them don't change their behaviour particularly. So what would a more, if you like, sociological approach to cultural change entail? Well, one of the key things that I think the research has failed to do so far is to fully embrace what I call co-production, or what others have called co-production, or public and patient involvement, in that most of the educational programs we have are a kind of top-down, here's the medical evidence, let's provide it to people, and when they get it, they'll change their behaviour. But that's a very unrealistic model, and actually if we start to talk to those involved in the sport who are going to be the recipients of these educational modules, then we're likely to make them much better. And qualitative health research can feed into that. In terms of cultural change for athletes, we need to think about how athletes are involved. And I've put in terms of inclusion, stability of inclusion and income. So inclusion is more about grassroots sport, and income obviously is more about professional sport. But one of the things that comes through all the qualitative studies that we have is that athletes continue to play with concussion because they want to be involved in the team. They don't want to drop out, because that has a huge impact on how they perceive themselves, and fundamental issues of identity. So how can we restructure sport so that concussed players can remain useful and part of the team? How can we structure professional sport so that contracts are longer to provide more security, which means that playing the next game is not absolutely crucial? So these are the kind of structural changes that need to go on to enable that cultural change. In terms of organisations, we might think about, and I've put here, provision of healthcare at and for sport. And my distinction here is at, in terms of what healthcare provision is actually available at the sports event, but also for sporting people who are injured through their sports participation. So one of the things that is quite clear is that people who get concussed during sport and have to enter the National Health Service or any kind of public health provision are hugely unsatisfied with the service that they get, and find that there's very little for them which is meaningful or allows them to follow that. But there's no research, or very little research, on trying to develop that and improve that. At the sports event, we need to think about those sporting fixtures where it's impossible to provide any professional medical health care. So who then has the responsibilities? How are they trained? And more importantly, how are they empowered? So the studies that we do have of clinicians that work on concussion suggest that they're often sidelined. They are not the most powerful or influential person in that arena. And we've seen, and the classic example is Mourinho overruling his doctor Eva Cañero on the pitch. That's not an isolated incident. That's not. It's a very graphic incident. But all the literature we have on this is that those medical people working in sports clubs are often in conflict with the coaches who have employed them and who have greater power over their contracts and their working practice. So we need to look at how we empower people who are in charge of these medical decisions to make them more effective in their jobs. Part of that would be more rigorous appointment procedures. The appointment procedures of medical staff in elite sport appear to be atrocious to me. And many people in sport will say, oh yeah, but that's how it used to be, it's all changed. We did some work 6 years ago, I think it was, and I think something like 5% of respondents, this is club doctors with clubs in the top 92, the 4 leagues that constitute 92 clubs, something like 5% of those doctors who responded showed that they were not even eligible to practice within professional football. And you could only think that there'd be a lot more who wouldn't respond to that survey because they wouldn't want to expose their limitations. So it was amazing. And the problem here is that there's very little evaluation of the implementation of those rules. The FA have changed their rules over the last 20 years in terms of what football club doctors need to have in terms of qualifications, but they don't implement it, and they assume that medical people will do things in the way that things are prescribed. But the messy world of sports medicine practice is very different to that. Cultural change is also going to involve social changes. I think we hugely underestimate the health costs of sport and exercise generally. I don't have time to go into it here, but it's a very dangerous thing to do. There are, best estimates, 29.3 million sports injuries in the UK, in England and Wales every year. And we don't recognise that. We think that sport is healthy. As part of that, we need to start celebrating precaution rather than risk. Much of the research suggests that elite performers or elite sports organisations are all driven about performance and not about longer term health, and we need to change that. And I think we also need to think about whether we can actually do cultural change only in relation to brain injury. For me, is it an oxymoron? That it's a necessary contradiction in terms. That if you want cultural change, you can't just do it in relation to brain injury. It must be all injuries. Penultimate slide. Concussion and gender. I think there's a really interesting thing to look at here, and it relates back to assessing the winners and losers of medical interventions. Because what we've seen in recent times is a growing body of research which suggests that females experience more concussions than males, worse concussions than males, and take longer to recover than males. Now, in part, this is a very welcome change, in that most of the research that we have on concussion is about male athletes. So somebody did a study of previous consensus statements. 80% of that research was based on male-only cohorts, a huge gender disparity. The problem with this work is that it largely attributes the differences between males and females to physical and physiological factors rather than social factors. So these social factors don't influence, for instance, neck strength, tackle technique, and so on. Now, my concern as a sociologist is that this seems eerily familiar to anybody who's studied the interface between medicine and gender and sport historically. Historically, there's a grand tradition of medical scientists saying sport is not appropriate for women. Look how they get more injured than males. And then explaining that in terms of biological differences and therefore cementing or concretizing those recommendations. So I think there's really interesting work to be done in terms of fighting this, because the implications are quite significant. We need to forward a social justice agenda in terms of making sports suitable so that everybody, or revised so that they're safe for everybody to take part in, not seeking to ostracize particular populations. Because ultimately what is being done here is to say, well, if we stop women playing sport, then the concussion in sport problem isn't as big, so we can carry on playing sport in exactly the way we always have done, or we think we always have done. So there's a really interesting body of work to be done around concussion and gender. To sum up, I think this is an area great for sociologists to get into and contribute to a really important public health agenda and social agenda. I think there are some things that we as qualitative health researchers can do which nobody else can do. And if we don't do it, then this body or this area and this policy formation is going to be the worse for it. But I think we want to draw on existing frameworks. I don't think we have to go into this blind. There are things that we can use to build on to structure the kind of inquiries that we do. Thank you very much.